One of those books was a book about artificial intelligence called The Creativity Code. And I think many people have been kind of blown away by this phase change that's happened in artificial intelligence and the way code is being written and what it can do. And as the introduction said, many industries, including publishing and authors and writing and music as well, are beginning to wonder what effect this is going to have on our world. I actually did a little experiment in my book where I got the text writing algorithms at the time to write part of the book, and I put a challenge out to see whether anybody could spot the bit that was written by a piece of code and not me. And not one person has identified this yet, which is deeply depressing because it's so badly written. It's absolutely clear which 3 paragraphs are the AI, and if that says something about my own writing style, God help me. But we're going to specifically look at the impact this technology is having and will have on the publishing industry, which of course includes editors, writers, and readers. But I thought to set the scene, Maru is coming very much from the heart of the publishing world, to hear a little bit about just what is the current uses, fears, dreams, strategies, and also a little bit about the software that you're developing, because I think that is super interesting as well. But actually, you said a little bit of the scene for where are we with AI and publishing?
Okay, thanks, Marcus. Sorry, I have a little bit of a sore throat, so I'm sounding a little raspier than I was hoping to.
Well, join the crowd, yes.
Okay, so I want to just start by telling you about how people within the publishing industry and writers are thinking about AI right now, because I don't think there's like one, there's not like one way in which they're thinking about it. There's a spectrum, and at the one end of the spectrum are people who were saying we will never touch it, and I don't want to have anything to do with it. I'm not saying this is good or bad, I'm just sort of giving a sense of the landscape. And what they're saying was going to end creativity as we know it, and that's one end of the spectrum. And then moving on from that, there are people who say, well, this can be used for good or it could be used for bad. But I'm curious about it and I want to try it. And I would say, realistically, and there's a lot of studies on this, most people have tried it and are, they're kind of scared of it. That's the sense that I get, that there are writers, publishers, editors, pretty much anyone, all they're hearing about is AI is going to take your job. That is the reason why people are afraid of AI, because they're seeing it as a competitor. And when you've used AI properly, the best versions of it, if you think about it as a competitor, it's easy to see why you would be scared of it, because it's very, very good. And so that is one. And then, of course, there's another extreme of people who say, well, it's just going to replace everything, and we're going to end up having everything written by AI. And my own personal view in this is like I'm very, very curious and interested and optimistic about what AI can do for the publishing industry, for writers, for creativity in general. And the reason I feel that way is because, the thing which no one says about is there's something called the adoption cycle. And it's not that even if you put the world's most amazing technology out there, it's not like people immediately understand how to use it, or they come to it at different times in their career, at different moments. Their experiences vary. So I think what this means is over the next few years, we're going to see a huge change in how people think about AI, and that is the first step to using it within your business or within your industry. But I would always encourage everybody in every industry to try it, because it's the fact that something so powerful and amazing exists and is out there. I see no reason not to try it.
There's a lot of examples of generative AI, which is generating text, but the idea also that an editor or a copy editor is taking like a house style, which can easily be sort of implemented within an algorithm. That seems a very obvious first use in publishing, which could put a lot of people out of a job.
Well, yes and no, because I don't think, for example, when you do something like a house style, there are a lot of decisions which have to be made. We are not at the point where AI is artificial intelligence assistive in nature. So at the moment. So when the so-called AGI is achieved by OpenAI or any of these other companies. And by AGI we mean, it really means when it is able to make decisions on its own. And right now it can't do that. It can only respond to things which you are asking, and you are still the person making the decision. So when it moves to that, potentially, but I would say, what it does, I would look at it the other way and say a copy editor who's can at best handle maybe 2 books a month. And if you're a freelance copy editor, if any of you are freelance copy editors, and you can handle 2 books a month, you'll be able to handle 6 books a month. And think about what that can do for your earning capacity, your revenue. You can just do a lot more, and your creativity is in no way compromised, because what it does is it's like saying you give the best of what you can give, but also gain from so many other perspectives which you otherwise would not have. Can it replace human beings? Yes, absolutely. That fear is not unfounded. But at the moment, I don't think we're there yet.
Charles, you're representing a lot of creative artists, especially in the television industry, and that, of course, we've seen the big strikes that have been happening because of fears of AI in generating incredible scripts and things like this. I mean, what's your experience of the people that you represent and their worries and fears?
If you asked me that question about 2 years ago.
Maybe. Just make sure you hold like just right on there. Yeah, you hold it right just like this then.
Really close? I think if you asked me that question 2 years ago, I would have said that there was no fear, no anxiety. It was seen to be like a toy that could be played with that might provide some ancillary colour to the work of the artists, the creatives that I work with. And the main part of my day job is to look after and to protect the artistic and professional interests of a series of creators, writers, actors, directors, some producers. In the last 6 months, that has, in the film and television world, where I am mostly working, has changed radically. There is now great anxiety and great fear. Interestingly, when I then transposed conversations with my friends in the publishing world, and in the context of today's conversation, I see this community as being perhaps a year or two behind, which is quite common. Publishing is a smaller industry than global TV, film, video, very significantly smaller, and slightly less commercially aggressive. So it is very obvious that some of the sort of the vanguard of artists facing up to the challenge of new technologies would be in the more commercialized industry, film, TV, rather than publishing. So one thing that I'm happy to talk about today is what's going on with screenwriters and how that should be inspiring and influential and really set a lead for book writers. So I'd like to talk about that today, to explain how I think the fears and anxieties that some of the artists I work with are entirely justified.
Well, would you like to kick us off on that? Because I think that
butt in.
Yeah, absolutely.
This gets. And I hope you'll enjoy hearing about this. I think it's a very useful example and illustration of what can be achieved. And I think the brief summary goes something like this. The screenwriters in America have been hugely successful in their negotiations with the studios, their trade negotiations in respect of their life and work for their professional body. And no one thought they would be. And the reason for that is that IT and tech is not normally within the ambit of the conversation between the owners of businesses and the workers that serve those businesses. Trade unions normally are about the bread and butter issues. They're about wages and conditions of work and terms of engagement and employment, but not normally about management strategy. that's something that in trade union law and in labour relations we would refer to as management prerogative. So the workers, the 98% of workers, don't get involved in those conversations. And so workers have been excluded from conversations about tech, finance, management, strategy. And for that reason, people felt the writers would have no chance. And the Writers Guild of America set an example for us all by saying, no, we refuse to go back to work until we can put this issue about IT and therefore this issue about AI on the table of our negotiations. No one thought they would do it. And they achieved precisely that. And they achieved it through two principal means, which I would urge upon our own community. And they did this, by the way, in the context of not saying block all AI, stop all AI. It's about how to use it, and that's something we'll come to in the conversation. So it's about using AI in an intelligent way, but putting regulation around it, stopping this unfettered, mad rush into using a technology that people don't understand. They said, stop, wait, think about jobs, think about livelihoods, think about the civilization that we work in. And they went to the negotiating table, and they had two strategies. One was labour solidarity, they stuck together. And most unions don't. And this was an extremely brilliant example of a union sticking together. And on this first issue, something I think we're going to get used to a lot in the 20th century. You think of trade union history, you think often you would think in any country in the world of industrial workers in cloth caps down a mine or at a printing press. But actually, this is white-collar workers. And what we're seeing is it doesn't matter, blue-collar, white-collar, whatever your own sort of style, sophistication, AI is coming for them. So they stood together. The second thing they did, this is the final thing that I think is important, is that they set out rules of engagement with the studios and with the streamers to say, AI is not a writer. AI is not going to be treated as a writer because it cannot, for legal purposes, generate copyright. And so therefore, this of course helps publishers and studios and streamers because they desperately want their artists to have copyright because then they can own something when they're selling it in the global market. So say it's not an author, it's not a writer, so we'll use it. But the extent to which we use it, if that helps us improve our work, we don't get paid any less. We don't miss out. So we, the workers, where there are huge gains available in financial models for what AI can do, we will protect for the workers our share of the equity. The upside comes back to the worker. They're the first trade union to have achieved this, the only trade union to achieve this, and book writers need to get on the same page.
Well, that seemed to be the message that, authors are not generally feeling, actually the one thing that festivals do very well, it makes us suddenly feel part of a community and group. So maybe JLF should be forming a kind of union for us to help us.
I think the work starts here today.
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah, Safia, what are your experiences with your introduction? You seem to be involved in so many things. So how is AI impacting on your world?
So I'll first start off with my general experience as a business strategist, and then I'll go into legal. My reckoning on artificial intelligence is that it's not going to be disruptive to the extent the current panic is. There's always going to be anxiety when something new happens. But if we study economics and we study job creation, every gap has been filled by a new opportunity. For example, there could be a complete new genre of people whose job is to criticize AI, or for example, in the context of your book, to identify the 3 paragraphs and say, this is a clear deviation. So it will be a sort of a skill set change. And I'll sort of borrow from an example. It's a little bit like, when we look at blockchain, there's so much of controversy around the world with particularly cryptocurrencies and others. But what essentially happens is that there is a hidden person who's created a particular asset. We don't know his name. There is arguments that was created in Japan, etc. But there is human involvement through technology. It may not be so obvious to you, but there is human involvement. Any activity which is debarred of human involvement is going to be by a human process struck down some way or the other, or at least made conducive in some way or the other. Now, whether you attack it on the fact that it doesn't have copyright, and therefore it has no legal rights, and arguably somebody will say if it has no legal rights, then you can't secure it, and therefore you can't monetize it, or it becomes a case where you say I can't, because I can't pinpoint on who I can sue for example, misinformation, and misinformation is not necessarily misleading, it could be irrelevant information. I mean, you could use algorithms, you could trigger them to sort of pluck what is more popular and sort of throw it your way. And there's been just a recent example of a bot whereby talking to a person started criticizing the same company. I mean, you saw that. So the question is, when we say that there is no liability, the nature of liability will shift. For example, it could go on to the host, it could go on to the intermediary. And then somebody will come and say, we have to start creating rules and we have to bring an accountability. And that accountability itself will cause a new genre of people to sort of emerge. So I feel it's going to be like the typical Darwin thing about adaptation or the survival of the species, and it'll just be a role change that will probably come from this.
And I think there are going to be a lot more new jobs out of this. I mean, already people are very good at giving prompts to actually initiate interesting work. I mean, a lot of people can use Midjourney or DALL-E to create rather boring images, but I just come back from staying with an illustrator who says, well, the art, there's a real art to this. I'm now using, I'm using poetry in a way to stimulate, and I'm seeing the sort of feedback loop. Also the data curator, all of these things are being made with data that's been given. That I regard as a really exciting new job. But I think the film industry is kind of interesting because ownership of a film is very unclear, and it's a company structure, if I understand it. And there's a lot of worry about, if you do work with an AI that has been trained on somebody else's work, where is the ownership of this? I'm prompted, but it's so the sense of who owns something which has had AI involved, therefore have a lot of people in the backstory. Is that an issue that you think is important?
Yeah, it's hugely important, that issue. And at the moment, I think in illustration of the writers in America debating with the studios, they were able to negotiate the position they did because the studios and the networks and big tech wanted them to assert their copyright so that they could then trade in that particular commodity. The question is, how quickly does that start to change and how quickly does the law start to evolve? And in this conversation, I think it's really helpful to understand that there are no countries that as yet have any proper regulatory framework for dealing with AI. We hold on to copyright law, which predates.
But sorry, just to interrupt you there, the first country to have done that is Japan. So Japan recently passed a law about 6 months ago where it allows legally the use of training data, copyrighted training data for AI. So it's legal.
I think it's the use is legal, but the actual debate
product
about
is
the
not,
ownership.
You mean the final
Yeah.
product is not copyrighted?
Yeah.
The training data is, you can use copyrighted
Because
data.
at the end, someone has to, in the end, own the thing for capitalism to work.
Which is why a film industry query to this kind of corporate.
All business will look to there being an ultimate owner. The question is, who should that be?
Yeah.
Okay, now let's just look at the world of books and let's imagine that ChatGPT 5 comes out and makes the step that it's expected to make within the next 12 to 18 months. So that you have an app that a very smart editor, obviously nefarious and immoral, but smart, with a publisher, they could sit in a darkened room and they could say, let us emulate the style of the country's greatest crime fiction writer and let us model all of the tropes. We've got these amazing algorithms that tell us exactly what the market wants, exactly the jokes that work, and the plot lines that work. Let's follow those algorithms and let's polish it off in the voice of X, you fill in the blank of your favourite author. And then let's find someone to own that. But let's find someone who's biddable and pliable and will do what they're told. And indeed, let's find someone that's even more attractive to the market than possibly some slightly smelly writer who isn't very good at cocktail parties. Step forward a celebrity.
This is called ghostwriting, isn't it?
It's like super sophisticated ghostwriting, but by ghostwriters who can churn out 50 books every half hour, better than you've ever seen before. But at that point, step forward, we're in the land of India and cricket is much on my mind at the moment, so think about Sachin Tendulkar.
Are you rubbing it in?
Yeah, no, I immediately think I'm against England, which is weird. You'll understand why. But there is this moment where you can see that clever editor and that clever publisher saying, okay, well, let's take this work and let's award the proprietary ownership to a super famous cricket player that everyone knows and loves, and suddenly it's his. But we do a deal with him about the terms of trade, and we know that he is going to set satisfactory terms of trade, and we know that he is going to toe the party line, and we can be pretty sure that they're not going to be odd or difficult or awkward. And I'm sure you can see where this is going, because where it's going is a possibility, and I'm sorry, I'm clearly, boomers and doomers, and I've now announced myself as doomer today, so sorry about that. But you can see where it's going, because it's going to a possible apartheid of those that are deemed to be acceptable to the publishing world, who we should be publishing. And those voices that are tricky and difficult and come from less fortunate places who don't have opportunity, don't have access to the smart ones, smart places, and to the infrastructure, those voices don't come through. And what we're seeing is the possibility for those who control the market to control the content for the first time. We all knew that the rich controlled the means of production. We all knew that they controlled the manner of distribution. But that was something, you could just be a girl from nowhere with some fire in your heart and a dream in your head, and you could get out there and do it. But now,
There's a wonderful Roald Dahl story from the Tales of the Unexpected, which is decades old, but it's called the Grand Automatic Grammaticizer. And it's exactly his idea that it's so easy to copy style, and and he bribes all of the authors to basically sign over the ownership of this thing, because they daren't admit that it's so easy. But Mary, that's an interesting question about the disadvantage, because that's one of the fears that this is taking, because it's basically a statistical analysis. So what is the most probable thing that will follow? And that will therefore give dominance to the loudest voice in the data. But I saw that on your website for this new software, you felt that it had a chance to actually do the opposite. It could give a voice to those who are not represented. How do you feel?
100%. That is exactly what I feel. And I want to speak about two things. The first is, I think the fear in the publishing industry is not of not enough content. There's no shortage of content without AI. Even if nobody ever wrote one word using AI, there's still too much content. The problem has always been and always will be of readership. So I don't see that as a problem, because it's hard enough getting people to read a book by immensely talented Nobel Prize winning author. So I don't really believe that suddenly, these books written by AI are going to be read by people who, I just don't see that happening. You can't convince, it's very hard, and I know this from 20 years of being a publisher, it's very hard to convince people to read a book, whether it is written by AI or by a human. So that is one. The second, I would actually go out and say, I think the AI has the potential to be incredibly democratizing to unheard voices. And I'll tell you why. I think I can say this. There are a lot of publishers in this room. Publishing, everybody knows, has a huge diversity problem. Huge. And part of that problem is intimately tied to the use of the English language. And I don't think people have understood that. English language represents a certain social class. It's a certain, in India, and a lot of other countries outside the US and the UK, where traditionally these conversations have been had. So if you go to India, you go to any country where there is somebody with a story to tell, but is not confident of writing in English, and they feel able to do that because they can write and express themselves better using AI. I assure you there are a lot of great stories out there which are currently being not able to come out because people don't, the bottleneck is access to the English language, access to the publishing world. access to an editor. That is the number one thing I've always heard, is that people say, they don't feel they have the authority. The word authority comes from author, and the word author is intimately linked to that. So yes, I completely concede your point on ownership. There's no getting around it. Nobody knows the answer to that, and I agree with you. That's something which has to be solved. But separate from that, I think something like this has the power to democratize who gets to tell stories and in what language. So I would think it opens up opportunities for people who just wouldn't otherwise have them.
I tend to agree with you. I've been to some very interesting conferences on the digital humanities and the way that this can be used as a tool to read things at scale that no one individual could ever do. And actually, for example, to recover Victorian novels that have not been read for 100 years, but actually have value that is being picked up by this new tool that can read at scale. So, and that seems to be true then, sort of horizontally in time-wise and geography as well, that you will find things. I was always amazed. I thought kind of recommender algorithms would always cause everyone to read the same 10 books. But actually that's not true. It's very mathematically chaotic in nature. A very small perturbance in what you like sends you off to a completely different bit of the library, which I think is really exciting. Safir, I wanted to come to you about an issue that is bubbling away at the moment, and your thoughts on it, which is authors who feel that their work has been used to train AI, and they feel that this is a real infringement on their work, and there are cases now being brought by authors and New York Times and things like this. What's your feeling about those legal cases?
So while the New York Times case is still sub judice, if you ask me as a lawyer, my feel is that there will be a finding against AI. I personally believe that you will not have the creative economy completely destroyed by saying you are entitled to do what you want to do. I also believe that somewhere down the line, since the people judging are humans, at the end of the day, the AI product is meant for humans. Humans, by definition, are consumers. It's not just about intellectual property rights, it's also about consumer laws. So the definition of consumer laws will obviously undergo a change in order to say what is mine should remain mine and what is undue should get into a sort of an accountability, which is what we're talking about, the author and authority. Now the question is, when the policy makers are also humans. You're not going to have a situation where the act is going to be created by a machine, and even if it is created by a machine or by an algorithm, the algorithm will be tweaked between one and the other by a human again. So the differentiation of different human skills itself will cause a collaboration. And if you have a collaboration model, then you'll have accountability, because then you have a live person and you'll be able to sue and make policies, etc. And I think it will just be a stage of evolution for some time. It's a great technology, there's no doubt about the fact it's a beautiful technology, but it will get evolved. And then, like I said, you create a new class of people. It's just like social media. You had people doing posts and then you had trolls. The troll became a different profession, and you had things like advertising, and you had things like endorsement, and then the law said that now if I have to talk about a product, I have to say in collaboration with. So the same model will follow in AI. And in an example of this sort, first, for example, the court might say, whatever is being done on the research front is good. You're enabling a lot of data to reach out to people, and therefore, like you said, you may be looking at works which are historical and you may be sort of bringing them up to life. But then they'll say, where is the accountability? Where is the consumer? I have not known a single product or service in the world where the name of an entity is not mentioned in case of a liability claim. How would you mention the name and liability claim itself will cause a new thought process, and that's where I think the opportunity for new jobs, new opportunities, even in terms of the multiple, for example, AI tools. If one particular tool puts out something in format A and another tool puts it in format B, there'll be somebody who's judging saying that A is better than B. And that process again will cause human discretion to be set up.
But isn't there perhaps a little something we're missing here? Which is that we're forgetting that AI itself is no normal standard consumer product. That, for example, let's think about medicine or the flying of airplanes, or slightly less standard, playing around with nuclear energy. All of those products are subject to protocols. and to regulatory bodies that carefully check the worthiness of these products before they go to the market. But yet, in the case of AI, rather than this being a careful, stewarded, organic process, isn't something else going on? Don't we find that actually these big tech monsters releasing, sorry, that's broad language, these big tech corporations releasing this product live to consumers with no regulation at all, you're effectively making all of us, all of humanity who has access to the internet, you're making us the sort of lab rats because there is none of this regulation now. And I think, as much as that I'm the doomer here, not the boomer, I'm not saying that the genie goes back in the bottle. And I'm not saying there aren't extraordinary benefits to what AI can do for us, but I'm saying we will be fools if we don't recognize that regulation has to come first and that protocols have to come first. And this is why, in a moment of huge press, which was then strangely forgotten very quickly, the Forum for the Future Institute, forgive me if I got that name wrong, who published the letter in May of last year. And you had at that moment, one of the signatories was Jeffrey Hind, who's often seen as the godfather of AI, who led the AI programs at Google for over a decade. He resigned from his position because he is so alarmed that this thing is running forward without any, and look at our governments, to expect our governments to be able to be ethical or moral about or even competent, frankly, about the management of such power. And by the way, sorry, just the other little thing we're missing, such power which is beyond any product we've ever made. Because in large language models, and in the move through generative AI now to something that will be the next step, we have something which the creators themselves have confessed they do not fully understand. One of the things about ChatGPT-4, which is available to you for you to use this afternoon, is that it has all sorts of unintended consequences and uses which the creators never anticipated, including the writing of poetry.
But that could be a very exciting opportunity. I mean, we don't want things that we expect. I mean, we want things which are new. That's true.
Exciting opportunity to have a nuclear bomb in your hand, to be running Chernobyl. But if you don't have protocols, it will blow up in your face. And we do move. If we just have these nice, gentle conversations about how exciting and interesting and what creative opportunities.
No, I
we do
agree.
it as a Chernobyl event for AI.
No, the point is that these conversations are being controlled at the moment just by the tech giants, and I think I mean, I signed that letter partly because I'm a tech optimist and a boomer, but my feeling was we need to all be involved in this conversation about what we want to do. Mary, you had an interesting point which you made to me in the Author's Lounge about the fact that the New York Times may regret pulling its data.
Yes.
Could you
But
explain that?
Before I do that,
Yes.
I want to talk about just something, because we've talked about how fast this technology has evolved, and it has incredibly fast. Came out October last year as a research preview, GPT-3 2.5 or whatever it was called. It was never meant to be a consumer product. It was a research preview, which is quite a common practice in tech companies, where you open it up and then it sort of went completely, like when people started using it, it became a consumer product because consumers started using it that way. It was not intended to be a consumer product. The second, I think everybody agrees there should be regulation. There's nobody really out there who thinks that AI should not be regulated. However, there are some concerns to do with regulation in AI about monopolies, which are, I think, quite well founded. There's two schools of thought. There is one school of thought which says it should be a closed source model, which is what the big tech companies like OpenAI and Elon Musk and all of these people want. And there's another set of people who want open source models, like there are a lot of French developers, a lot of other companies around the world developing open source models which anybody can see, which have quite a lot of transparency involved, anyone can see what's happening there. So yes, I think everybody instinctively feels there should be regulation, but regulation brings, the regulation doesn't often watch out for the interests of consumers. It often watches out for the interests of donors, who often are big tech companies themselves. And so, while I agree, I completely agree with you that there should be regulation, I'm not optimistic that it will be in the best interest of the consumer, necessarily.
Or indeed of the workforce,
Yes.
or the creators.
Yes.
And that goes back to the point we were discussing before about don't expect government to stand up and deal with this. It's going to be for the hundreds of millions of people in our industry, talking about white-collar workers, of course, but it's going to be hundreds of millions of people in the workforce who will need to stand together on this, because government is not going to challenge the interests of big tech. We have an American election this year, we have an Indian election, we have a British election, European, but we have this big American election coming. And whoever wins or whoever loses, it's not, in terms of the macroeconomic challenges that America faces from China and from elsewhere, they're not going to somehow put the brakes on the American tech companies.
No country.
That's not going to happen.
I think Europe is probably the one place which will lead. It did on data protection and
Yeah, I think
probably.
that Europe will be interesting from that respect, but don't expect American government to do it. So you are then back to labour relations, solidarity, back to Michael, that here at Jaipur Literary Festival we start the global trade union for writers.
Safi,
No, I don't necessarily agree with this, and I'll just give you an example. Nobody in the world came and pointed out saying that China will get into a problem when it came to US, when it came to privacy, for example. It just evolved. Now, for example, when you have, say, a user industry in India, since we're talking in context of election, nothing. If you have a user industry in India that starts dying out, the government will come and say, I don't care about what you do in US, but I will not allow Microsoft to do this in India. They have blocking mechanisms, they have regulatory mechanisms, they'll have, they already protect the local industry. And with the sort of global wars that are happening with WTO and others, initially there will be chaos, because every country will make their own rules. And then there will be a consensus. And then there will be argument of the consensus with public, and it's possible consumers initially don't get a pie, but at least they'll be better off from where they are. The first crux of this will be accountability. For example, if Microsoft says that, look, I am taking responsibility, then they tell Microsoft, but where's your policy? And it's happening, for example, with Apple in India, with the sort of payment gateway. That Apple is a giant, it's a tech giant. How is the government of India saying, look, I'm going to make policies for Apple Pay? It starts with somewhere. And it's the same thing as happened all over the world. There's no reason why it's not going to happen.
I think we're going to turn to some questions from our audience. We've got 10 minutes left. If anyone would like to ask the panel a question, please put up your hand. The microphone will come to you. So yeah, you can stand up, that'd be great.
Hi, I have a couple of questions. The first one would be for Charles, and Meru as well. So what would AI regulation look that's something that favors consumers and workforce, given how it is misused and how something like even internet that's existed for decades is still not properly regulated. So how would that look? How would that regulation translate to AI? That's first question. And the second one, will the publishing industry have a similar strike to, say, the actors and the writers strike in Hollywood in the publishing industry, against AI use? And do you think that could push towards the regulation aspect?
I'll do two. You can do one. Okay, I'm going to answer the second question first, because I don't have the answer to the first one, so I'll let Charles handle that one. I would advise, if it was me saying, what should the publishing industry, what should writers do? I would say, wait and see what happens. I would advise everybody to not take strong positions right now. The reason being, you will have to walk yourself back from those positions. I'll give you a simple example. If anybody was to get up today and say, I'm never going to use AI, maybe they can make that choice today. You can say, I will never touch ChatGPT. I'm going to be totally vegan about it, and you can't make me, and I can't make you. But as it gets more integrated into your daily life without it saying AI on it, which it will, as soon as in a few months, your iPhones will have AI. Google search, and I was just talking to Marcus about this, search engines themselves, all search engines are moving from web-based search to AI-based search. So there's a company I was talking about called Perplexity AI, which is overtaking Google's on the App Store, their own apps, and it is based on Google. So it is something Google desperately wants to do themselves, but they can't because their existing model is based on advertising. And AI-based search does not support advertising. So it's just a business reason why they're not doing it, and they will do it. So it's not like in 6 months an author or anyone else is going to say, I'm going to use Google. And if it evolves towards being an AI-based search, it's all based on the same training data. So I don't think anyone's going to be able to say I'm not going to use it, because sometime after a point, it'll be like saying I don't use the internet. So that was the second question. So don't take strong positions.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question, which is what does the regulation look like? What might the sane, sensible, decent regulation look like? Okay, so the problem is that regulation will look like whatever your political leadership wanted to look like. So get out and vote this year, and be wary of the fact that big tech can lobby far more effectively than you can alone, and thus we're back to my call for the workers to unionize. Now, but say everyone held hands and fought sweet thoughts together, what might a solution for regulation be? And I would say this, I think the solution is, how do we provide for a fair share of the equity, of the richness, of the upside for everyone? How do we do that? Because it's not what we're seeing now. There are some predictions that in the next 10 years, if AI moves to the place we think it might do, it could be worth as much as $13 trillion to the companies developing that AI. This induces a fever dream of cash for these big corporations, and they therefore make decisions in the way that companies make decisions, and as the constitutions of these companies require them to make decisions based on return to shareholders. So time and time again, you will see CEOs, let's not call them out by name, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, etc., who will make decisions which will have adverse effects. But step back from that and imagine good government that says, what we will do is we will share the benefits. This AI is out there, it's going to return extraordinary opportunities for mankind, but we will share the benefits. And that's actually what this writers' union did in America. They can use it, but they'll get paid for the work even if they're not doing the work. And I would very quickly on this, because I think it's really interesting, go back to a couple of examples. Example number one being a mechanization that took place in London. Rupert Murdoch, who owns a couple of publishing companies that are here today, decided to computerize the printing of his newspapers. It was called the Wapping scandal or scenario, whatever you want to call it. And what happened was he took a secret warehouse outside central London, set up the computerizing, gave the unions a day's notice they could accept £2,000 redundancy. Many of these workers would be working for 30 years. And accept that redundancy, or they would get nothing. They went on strike, they got nothing, and he put 6,000 print workers out of work because, firstly, government supported him. Thatcher sent the police to blow away these protesters. The unions were just emasculated. But the other thing that happened was that not only did the government side of them, but they immediately lost their jobs, and that was always going to happen. If you compare that to the 1950s in America, where the miners decided that they could see it coming and they negotiated this amazing agreement in 1950, which became the benchmark for what the writers did last year, called the Miners' Union Mechanization Agreement. And these miners foresaw the coming of tech. And they knew they couldn't beat it, but they had to regulate for it. And they took action soon enough so that deals were made for the retraining of the workers, for reskilling, retooling, and also for a position to go back to the workers in the company, an upside of cash royalty, effectively, for what would happen when big machines came into the mines. So
the coal miners are now becoming the data miners. And that's the kind of. And we have time for another. Ryan,
Real quick
onslaught of questions. So has somebody got a mic?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
And really appreciate it, and I understand you're dealing with a subject that's probably next to godliness over here, so fairly complicated. But to keep it simple, the way I'm looking at it, I'm trying to understand it just today. If I put my book for editing in AI, and it gives me a nice clean output, are there mechanisms today, or do we have any mechanisms that will eventually prevent my book from being part of the whole LLM model? That becomes over there, the next person can go, hey, just write this kind of book for me and book. Out comes my book free of copyrights. Is that a fear that I have, or is it something that's legitimate and is being addressed, or how does that work?
Which is exactly why ownership will become critical at some point of time, because if you can't attribute ownership to something that is machine oriented, then you will, at some point of time, you will say, you know, I have to step back. I don't want to do this book because there's too much of effort and labor and there's no reward. So you will sort of renegotiate your contracts and say, and that's why I say there'll be collaboration. In fact, most of the AI models that require human interface subsequent to what the AI does will end up being more successful, and the humans will take ownership.
Got it. So just to be
I'd love to have a chance for another question, so because we're going to run out of time, unfortunately.
Very good discussion. So when we talk about regulations, my question is that why we are saying that government is responsible for regulation, like making these regulations. Why can there be a better way that these companies like OpenAI and Google, because they can be held responsible for the regulation itself, because these guys know that much more and they know better like how these models are behaving, right? So before shipping these models, why can't they check that whether it's
No, philosophically they can, but like Charles rightly pointed out, there are very large tech companies. It's a conflict of interest. They don't want you to regulate.
On that note, we will have to wrap up. Next year there will be 3 algorithms being interviewed by another algorithm. Oh, we've got time for one more question. Great. Okay, so there was a gentleman in the waistcoat here. Yeah, you just have it. As long as it's a quick question, so I have to go to another session.
So I think there should not be any restriction on AI because it should have its natural growth. How human civilization has grown from oil, fire, and electricity and computer. Because when we studied in 1978 in universities, we were not allowed, the term PANS card was there. So we have to do only one programming for transport. So even our professor was not allowed to task the computer. So we did not have the capability to PANS, and then he will put in the compiler and it will come out output.
Yes, so should we just let AI run?
There is no restriction because that is
How about that?
So
No
there should not be any
restrictions.
restriction on AI. It should be given the opportunity to.
See, the restrictions won't come by growth. Growth is not going to be problematic for anybody. Every country wants growth, every company wants growth. It will come when the growth interferes with rights. See, today you are ignoring that there is something called corporate governance. Corporate governance will bring in accountability even to those who create it within their ecosystem. I mean, why did, for example, Mark Zuckerberg in his trial, when they're asking him, did you indicate which hotel you are staying in? Does your algorithm pick that up? And he says, no, I will not like to disclose that. So they'll say, how are you dividing the interest between what you do and what you expect your customers to do?
Meru.
Yeah, just a final thing, because and I think we can close the session with that. I think there is a natural boundary to AI growth, which is, I don't think will come from governments or tech companies themselves. It will come from the limitations in the training data. If you think about it, current models have been trained on all of humanity's knowledge. That's what the training data is. The problem faced by AI companies now is what is the next set of training data that you can train on. And there's 2 schools of thought, as there inevitably are. One says, well, what do we train on? Because we've already read everything. And the second says, we're going to use something called synthetic data, which is a fancy way of saying stuff created by AI. It learns on itself. So the big question, which I think every tech company is also asking, is will AIs which evolve on synthetic data be as good as those which are trained by humans? So that's a question which I'm afraid is beyond my pay grade, so I can't answer.
This is, so many interesting things still to talk about, but please give my humans a big round of applause.